In this short video, we'll talk a little bit about the heart sounds. And this will include the very characteristic heart sounds you may be used to hearing about or literally hearing, the lub dub. Okay, but we'll point out some others as well. So first I want to point out these are sounds that are heard through a process called auscultation using a stethoscope on the surface of the anterior or posterior thoracic wall, right? You probably all had this done where physician applies the head of the stethoscope to your chest and listens to your heart sounds. And again, it can be heard from a variety of locations. For our purposes, I'm not concerned about which heart sounds are heard better at one location versus another. I'm more concerned with our understanding of what causes these heart sounds, the order in which they occur, and importantly, the correlating them with the mechanical activities of the heart. Right? So first of all, heart sounds are derived from what's known as turbulent flow. Right? So these are not sort of sounds made by, like a door slamming where physical, surfaces hit one another. Instead, these are sounds made when blood essentially sort of changes direction rapidly or forcefully moves in a particular direction, and it generates swirling flow rather than laminar flow, which is a very concentric, smooth flow. But it generates this turbulent flow that makes a lot of noise. If you've ever been near a river that has it's running very high and it has rapids in it, like a lot of rocks, and it's running very quickly, you'll notice it's quite loud, right? And so these are the sounds we're hearing through auscultation with a stethoscope. And so what we want to do, though, is correlate the hearing of those sounds. And so our heart sounds are listed down here. They're numbered, actually. Right? So this trace at the bottom here would be a trace generated by a stethoscope that has an electronic recording device. Right? So a stethoscope that is not just you're listening to, but you are actually recording what's coming through the stethoscope. Okay, and so anywhere we get a non-flat line, we get a deflection, like here, right, and here, right. These are our heart sounds, right, and typically there are 3 heart sounds identified. The 4th one is pathological, meaning you shouldn't have that heart sound unless you are ill. And I'll point that one out as well. That's heart sound 4. But what we want to do is walk through the cardiac cycle here and see what's causing these sounds, right? So if we look at the first heart sound, it's when the AV valves close. Well, valves open and close according to the pressure gradients across those valves. So when the AV valves close, that's when blood is tending to flow backwards into the atria. And that would occur when the ventricular pressure exceeds or begins to exceed the atrial pressure. And if you see our pressure traces up here, right, here's our ventricular pressure trace. And as the ventricles start to contract and that pressure rises, it's going to cross over our atrial pressure trace here, right? So our atrial pressure is falling as the atria start to relax. And that point at which they intersect, right, is when the pressure gradient flips. And the pressure in the ventricles is higher, right, our red arrow here, and it would close the AV valve. And that's going to cause this sort of sloshing of blood up against the AV valve and that turbulent flow that I just mentioned, and we're going to get heart sound 1, also known as lub, right? So this is our lub sound. Then the ventricles will continue to contract and generate pressure isovolumically. They're not moving blood yet. Right here, the semilunar valve opens because we're going to exceed the arterial pressure, this trace. I'll put this trace in green. Right, so this is our arterial blood pressure, right? So notice that line is under, at that point, our ventricular pressure trace line, right? This red line. And so that means that the ventricular pressure exceeds the arterial pressure, and so the semilunar valve would be open. Okay, and so that sometimes that contributes to sound one. Sound one is a little bit prolonged. Remember, these are very fast events. But so the second half of part one might be that semilunar valve opening with a little bit of turbulent flow as blood flows out into the aorta. Certainly the major part of that would be AV valves closing. Then we're going to be ejecting blood, right? Here's our ejection phase, right? This is the ejection phase of our cardiac cycle of the ventricular systole, right? That's occurring here at the peak pressures in the ventricles. But notice then our pressures start to fall, go down, and at some point they will no longer be higher than our blood pressure, right? Our ventricular pressure is going to start to fall rapidly, right? It'll become isovolumic because our semilunar valve is going to close right here, right? So we stop ejecting. Well, when the semilunar valves close, basically blood in the aorta or the pulmonary trunk, but it's more dramatic in the aorta because of much higher pressure, that blood will tend to flow backwards for a moment, okay? And that blood will flow backwards up against the semilunar valve, closing it, creating turbulent flow, and we're going to get heart sound 2, right? Heart sound 1 is largely AV valves closing. Heart sound 2 is largely the turbulent flow associated with semilunar valves closing. Then as mentioned, we're isovolumic until that ventricular pressure falls below our atrial pressure. Remember our atrial pressure we had sort of in a purple color here, right? And so once we're below that, our AV valves are open again. That occurred right here. And we're filling. And notice we're passively filling, right? Because the atria are not contracting yet. And we're going to get this third sound right here that is due to rapid passive filling. Sort of like think about pouring water into a bucket and how it swirls around and actually makes a sound. That's kind of what the heart sound 3 is due to, this rapid filling, passive filling of low pressure filling of the ventricles. Now, if we were to go over, and again, we could put it over here, right? If we went out a little bit farther, but remember, this is going to repeat, this cycle loops, right? And so this rising spot here is actually also over here. And heart sound 4, if it exists, occurs during active filling by the atria of the ventricles. And heart sound 4 would sit right before heart sound 1. Remember, this guy is pathological. Well, let me go back. Heart sound 1 and heart sound 2, that's lub. Heart sound 2 is dub. Right? Heart sound 3 is in kids often, not often heard in adult. It tends to disappear in adults, that sort of passive filling sound. And then heart sound 4 shows up in older patients. And not just healthy older people, but older people that have diseased hearts. And the rationale there is that the ventricular walls get kind of rigid. The ventricular wall doesn't sort of distend outward. Think of not so much like filling a bucket, but like filling in a water balloon, right? Well, if the water balloon becomes more rigid, that active filling sort of creates like this reverberation as the blood starts to rapidly fill it, and you get more turbulent flow. And so, again, due to this sort of loss of elasticity in people with diseased hearts, they can get a pathological heart sound 4, right? So 1 and 2 are normal in all people. 3 is often in kids, sometimes in pregnant women because of an elevated blood volume. They get the heart sound 3, they'll show up. And then it usually disappears post-pregnancy. But heart sound 4 is definitely pathological. Okay, so our heart sounds indicate mechanical actions largely of the valves, 1 and 2, but also of passive filling 3 and active filling 4 when it exists, again, only in diseased people, diseased hearts. And And in all cases, it's due to turbulent flow by these rapid changes in the direction the blood moves. For instance, the blood actually, at heart sound 2, blood actually flows backwards through the aorta for a very split second. Right? When the ventricular wall is relaxing and no longer ejecting, the blood tends to flow backwards in the aorta into the heart. But before it really does flow into the heart, that semilunar valve closes and the blood sort of sloshes up against that closing door. Right? And so again, turbulent flow generating all of these heart sounds.